Thank you to everybody who's here for taking the time to come, especially for those of you on the other side of the world whose time is in the middle of the night. For 10 nights in a row, as you know, America has been rocked by protests against the murder of George Floyd by Minneapolis police officers. That murder has become a shock heard around the world. The clarion call that Black Lives Matter has been taken up by thousands in London at the gates of 10 Downing Street, in the city center of Birmingham, England, in Paris, in Sydney, Australia, and elsewhere. I, for one, am glad to see yet another great awakening of public awareness about fatal police-citizen encounters, even as this global reaction has deepened the anguish over police conduct in hundreds of cities across the United States. Not since the era of Reconstruction after the American Civil War has the legitimacy of democratic policing been so profoundly challenged in America. Then, as now, Black Americans were frequently murdered by state and local police with apparent impunity. Then, as now, Americans were deeply divided over issues of how to use the military to deal with protests. Then, as now, an impeached yet unconvicted president occupied the White House while failing to uphold a rule of law. A century and a half since the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, the problems of American policing remain similar in some respects to those of the past. Yet many problems are new. The range of possible solutions is also new. One of them is the unprecedented demand to eliminate or reduce funding for American police, framed by an argument against the very idea of a democratic citizen police institution. In his book, The End of Policing, for example, Professor Alex Vitale has contended that America would be better off without any police at all, while using the police budget for alternative institutions to manage community conflict. Before even considering any proposals to abolish or even partly defund the police, we might recall a classic remark about solving problems, first published in a book on physics by Albert Einstein and Leopold Infield in 1938. The quote offers guidance to anyone who tries to solve problems. Here's the quote: "The formulation of a problem is often more essential than its solution, which may be merely a matter of mathematical or experimental skill. To raise new questions, new possibilities, to regard old problems from a new angle requires creative imagination and marks real advances." End of quote. So our ability to find and adopt solutions that work for improving policing may depend on how we frame these problems for analysis. If we are to heed another injunction, to never let a good crisis go to waste, we must be sure that we frame the question in a way that provides a feasible pathway to progress in this moment of opportunity. We can start by thinking through some of the most frequently used frameworks for police reform. For example, many have framed the problems in America as a failure to punish rogue cops. Others have denied that the killers are exceptions. They frame the problem as rogue cultures of policing. Solving both problems may be useful, but neither target for police reform offers a sufficient framework for implementing change. Even if we propose ways for police agencies to tackle both rogue cops and rogue police cultures, the success of those proposals may depend on broader changes of democratic governance for issues of crime and disorder. In order to target effective solutions to the current crisis, we need to think even harder about how to formulate the problem to be solved. For many, targeting rogue cops is just a cheap way out of taking responsibility. We cannot accept the characterization of torture and murder as unintentional or committed by the rotten apples that result unavoidably from placing many apples in a barrel, an accident, a random act of God. That formulation of the problem is being challenged by new and better research, such as the analysis by Linda Zhao and Andrew Papachristos of 240,000 complaints against Chicago police officers. What they found by social network analysis is patterns of links among accused police that predict their future shootings. Growing evidence also suggests that people who would make bad decisions in American policing can be identified by testing even before they are appointed as police officers. Other research finds patterns of repeated disciplinary actions that can predict which officers are most likely to kill people, both legally and illegally. How we can apply that research to stop rogue cops, however, requires a new framework for making and enforcing police policies. Many other observers have attacked the rogue cop framing, regardless of its potential to predict and prevent rogue actions. These observers point to a rogue culture of policing in some police departments. Whether driven by racism or just by occupational solidarity, the rogue culture describes a police department that takes the law into its own hands. And with 18,000 local police agencies, the population adjusted equivalent of over 3,000 police agencies in the UK, which currently has only 45, the chances of some of those 18,000 police agencies going rogue are not small. A recent example is Ferguson, Missouri, population 21,000 people, with 48 police officers in 2014 when Michael Brown was killed. The classic example of a rogue culture is what sociologist William Wesley described in his 1951 PhD dissertation at the University of Chicago. Published in 1970 under the title Violence and the Police, Wesley's work was the result of a 2-year participant observation study of policing in Gary, Indiana, an industrial community in the Chicago metropolitan area, then with 130-some thousand residents. Among the many powerful findings that Wesley reported, the most memorable are found in a chapter called The Public as Enemy. Wesley's quotes and surveys of the police officers show their ongoing resentment of public criticism and their readiness to use violence illegally, if it serves a noble cause or if police authority is seen to be challenged. Racism and prejudice of all kinds are revealed in Wesley's view that police define the law by imposing their own morality on conduct. For the Gary police in 1950, the law was police opinion based on the personal morality of police officers. Now, much has changed in Gary since 1950, as well as in New York, LA, and other cities, small and large. What has not changed in America is the scarcity of references to policing by consent. This core principle of British policing is taken for granted in many other countries, but not in the US. President Trump's response to recent disorders, for example, was to tell authorities to dominate any lawbreakers, just as he dominated many law-abiding people in front of the White House this week. His purpose was to arrange a photo opportunity of the president holding a Bible in front of a church damaged by protesters. Whether he broke the law in doing so is a contested question. Whether he called for policing by consent is not contested. He did not. A speech at a recent Trump rally by Lieutenant Bob Kroll, president of the Minneapolis Police Union, gives the problem of a rogue culture in policing a new meaning. To the extent that a rogue presidency permits or encourages police to undermine a rule of law, we must adjust our problem-solving framework accordingly. If such a president can attract the support of a substantial portion of local police officers, the threat of a new kind of civil war in the event of a close election this November must be assessed. At the least, police union support for the president makes the concepts of rogue cops or rogue police agencies far too narrow to adequately frame the problem of police killings of citizens. Yet in framing that problem, we must be careful in straying too far from the police institution itself. The question of what is to be done is often framed too broadly to produce any meaningful change. For many people, and for understandable reasons, the framing of police misconduct should be all about race. In a country founded by accepting African-American slavery in its constitution, the issue of race in policing will always be central. As former Vice President Biden said yesterday, there is an ongoing battle for the soul of America, and race is central to that battle. John Meacham is the author of a 2018 book with the title Biden Cited. As Meacham has argued, there have been many moments in American history when a battle has raged for the soul of America. Meacham quotes Abraham Lincoln to say that in such battles, the better angels of our nature have always won the day so far. Sadly, those victories come at great cost, and none of them has been permanent. Almost 150 years after the truce at Appomattox was signed at the end of the Civil War, there is evidence that the Civil War over white supremacy never really ended. As Joe Biden said yesterday, it may be that 10 to 15% of Americans are simply not very good people. Many Americans would agree with that assessment, as well as with a related, very broad point made this week by President Trump's former Secretary of Defense, James Mattis, about the policing of the United States and the peacekeeping in our country. What Mattis said was that Donald Trump is the first president in my lifetime who does not try to unite the American people, does not even pretend to try. Instead, he tries to divide us. We are witnessing the consequences of 3 years of this deliberate effort. Mattis was joined by his successor, the current Secretary of Defense, Mark Esper, in resisting President Trump's leadership. Esper publicly challenged and effectively stopped President Trump's plans to send the US Army into American cities to suppress the protests over George Floyd's murder by Minneapolis police. For his own act of resistance, Mr. Esper may be sacked, but for today, he gave the better angels another win. What no Secretary of Defense can do, however, is to solve the problems of racism and excessive force in American policing. Neither can former President Obama, whose good faith efforts this week illustrated another risk in framing the question, the risk of framing questions too narrowly. The limitations of framing the question too narrowly are sadly apparent in his speech this week and in his support for the protests against police crimes, with unifying language that was refreshing and most welcome indeed. Yet his specific proposals for police reform implicitly targeted the question of what policies should each of the 18,000 police departments adopt to control deadly force. What he did not target is the question of how to get these policies adopted, implemented, and complied with in 18,000 local police agencies across 50 separate states. Citing the work of the Police Use of Force Project, President Obama reasonably urged police agencies to adopt these 8 specific policies. 1, require officers to de-escalate situations where possible. 2, prohibit officers from using maneuvers that cut off oxygen or blood flow, including chokeholds or carotid restraints. 3, require officers to intervene and stop excessive or unnecessary force used by other officers and report those incidents. 4, restrict officers from shooting at moving vehicles. 5, limit the types of force and or weapons that can be used in specific types of resistance. 6, require officers to exhaust all other reasonable means before resorting to deadly force. 7, require officers to give a verbal warning when possible before using serious force. And 8, require officers to report each time they use force or threaten to use force. Now, these are all great policies. My own research has empirically demonstrated the value of some of them in saving lives. But it is also effective for your health to practice a habit of daily exercise to save your life. And if you want to adopt a habit of daily exercise, you can surely find a list of great exercises. But for both policing policies and doing exercises, the operative word is if. So if we frame the problem of American policing correctly, the question is not what is to be done or what policies should be adopted. The realpolitik of America forces us to ask 2 questions that are far more practical, questions that contain no if in them. These questions are firstly, who can get something done? And secondly, how to get it done. These questions can be framed on the basis of the evidence for 3 connected premises. The first premise is that American police reform requires legislation, not just administrative action. The requirement for legislation is based on the second premise, that local police agencies and governments have currently far too broad and largely unregulated powers to hire and dismiss or not dismiss individual police officers. The third and most important premise is that the level of government with the greatest power to change policing is not national or local, but in the 50 state capitals of the 50 United States. The reason to target state governments for creating solutions to police problems is reminiscent of Willie Sutton's explanation of why he robbed banks. His answer was, because that's where the money is. When it comes to regulating police agencies, the states are the best target because that's where the power is, the constitutional power to create and destroy police agencies, and to license or revoke the power of any individual to serve as a police officer. This fact is also true by default. Even if the federal government tried to take action on the police, the bitter partisanship of the Congress would make any action impossible. Similarly, even when a majority of American voters choose one candidate, the loser of the election may become president. In a nation that is so sharply divided, where so few people of youth and minority status get out and vote, a nation where conservative states hold far greater voting power per person than progressive states, there is a perennial threat to democracy at the national level, not at the state level. But there is no time to reform the Electoral College. There's no time to change the political landscape. Police legitimacy is becoming a matter of party politics rather than a transcendent element of the rule of law. Getting anything done must accept these brute facts and seek targets of opportunity. Like evidence-based policing, the targets must be selected on a principle of triage, aiming at places in which police reform can do the most good. The best place to do that is in a state government, one that is open-minded, at least for the moment, about new solutions to policing problems. For that reason, I address my questions and my proposals to the 41st governor of Minnesota, the Honorable Timothy J. Walz. I do so not just because my daughter and her family live in Minnesota, less than 2 miles from a burned out police station. I do so not just because I spent 10 years working in Minneapolis with a great police leader, Anthony V. Boza, now age 92, who was and is a fierce defender of the rule of law. Tony Boza fired rogue cops every chance he could. He also cultivated the many committed police officers who worked there in the 1980s. Since his departure in 1989, the department has suffered greatly. But Minneapolis and Minnesota is an excellent case study in not just what is to be done, but who can do it and how. I address my question to Minnesota's governor because he is in the position to do something that could set a national example. I do so because his actions could start a national movement and be replicated in at least several other states. I do so because under the US constitutions, all 51 of them, with one for every state, each city and county police force is a creature of the state, and if anything can be done about American territorial policing, it must be done at the state level. Out of all 50 of the US states, Minnesota is now the one with the widest open window of opportunity. Its governor and speaker of the House are both Democrats. The Republican Party holds the Senate by a slim margin. Now in his second year as governor, Mr. Walz has over 2 more years in his term, and he also has, as of today, the greatest amount of political capital of any governor in America to pioneer a new solution to the governance of policing. Thus, my answer to the question of who can get something done is Governor Walz. The next question in this framework is how he can get it done. The answer to that question, of course, must be tightly linked to answering the question of what is to be done. With this framework, I can build on our premise that the states have given far too much autonomy to local governments to regulate their own police forces. And what is to be done is for the state to take it back. It is relevant to note here that much the same can be said about prosecutors in the United States, who are almost always locally elected. It is relevant to note that the local prosecutor in Minneapolis last week was criticized for actions that were too little or too late. It is relevant to note that at the state level of government, Governor Walz took the extraordinary step of appointing the elected state attorney general, a former member of Congress named Keith Ellison, to intervene in a local criminal matter. As the Associated Press reported, The governor's unusual decision to put Attorney General Keith Ellison in the lead was a win for local civil rights activists who say the longtime prosecutor does not have the trust of the Black community. The fact that the state attorney general almost immediately filed criminal charges against all 4 officers present and raised the seriousness of the murder charge against Derek Chauvin demonstrates to many the value of a system of police prosecution that is independent of local politics. In contrast to the 1 million residents of Hennepin County, where Minneapolis is located, there are almost 6 million voters at the state level. The county prosecutor in Minneapolis has been elected and re-elected by local voters for over 15 years, in which time he is said to have been too lenient in his prosecution of crimes by police. If Governor Walz were to frame the question of policing solutions more broadly as state takeovers of local control of police, he could build on the apparent success with the state attorney general. He could even go on to ask whether the Minneapolis Police Department itself could be replaced or supplemented by a new institution. Rather than defunding the police, the answer to our what question could be to rebuild the Minneapolis police from scratch with a parallel police force that would gradually replace the current department. There are several precedents for that approach in the US. One is the simple takeover of local police agencies by statutory changes, making the governor the person who appoints a big city police chief. And a century ago, this was done in Baltimore, Kansas City, and St. Louis. Yet in the current context, such a minor change would likely have little impact on the legitimacy of the Minneapolis Police Department. From the standpoint of public perception, the Minneapolis police appear to be morally bankrupt. Citizen surveys could test this hypothesis, but few American cities have ever seen police stations burned out by local residents enraged by police misconduct. Coming on the heels of international infamy for the murder of Justine Diamond, an Australian who was murdered by a Minneapolis police officer in 2017, there is a case to be made that it is time to retire the current culture and brand of the Minneapolis Police Department and start over again. Something similar was done with great success in the city of Camden, New Jersey in 2012, when a police force about half the size of the Minneapolis department was disbanded, and the Camden County Police Force took over the policing duties for the city. One driving factor in this radical change was the financial bankruptcy note of the city of Camden. In the case of Minneapolis, however, and perhaps many other American cities, the issue is not money, it's morality. As my colleagues, Professor Sir Anthony Bottoms and Dr. Justice Tankaby have written, police departments must gain their legitimacy and keep it through an ongoing daily dialogue about the moral basis of what police do. Police must persuade the public, as well as themselves, of the moral rightness of their work, their decisions, and their systems for hiring and retaining individuals who make those decisions. But what should happen when they fail? What happens when their moral capital for policing offers insufficient liquidity to stay in business? In case of a business, it goes bankrupt and is dissolved. This has happened not just for financial reasons, but also for moral reasons. In 2002, the large American accounting firm Arthur Andersen voluntarily surrendered its licenses to practice as certified public accountants in the US after it was found guilty of crimes in the firm's auditing of Enron, an energy corporation which had filed for bankruptcy in 2001. The word voluntary in the demise of Arthur Andersen is relevant to the question of how the governor of Minnesota could reconstitute the Minneapolis police. And it's all about whether it's voluntary for the mayor. In many public appearances, the governor has acknowledged the current mayor of Minneapolis, Jacob Frey, a fellow Democrat who was elected in 2018 on a pledge to reform his city's police. Any mayor could be a powerful opponent to any plan to replace a city's police department. Any mayor could be an equally powerful ally to a governor who sought to do so. If a mayor and a governor could work together to solve policing problems, that would also set a national example that might spread the idea beyond a single police force. The critical issue in any such plan is how to avoid a de facto police strike, at least during a transition from one local police monopoly to another. A de facto police strike, working to rule book, doing as little as possible, failing to arrest violent criminals, this would not just threaten the success of a plan to rebuild local policing. It could also cause major loss of life, property, and security. Remember my family who live in Minnesota. For me, this is not an abstract hypothesis. I have skin in this proposal. My proposal was first presented not in Minnesota, but in a 2002 volume on policies for crime. I had Philadelphia in my mind at that point, and the basic idea for replacing it with an alternative police department was to be very clear that no one's job is threatened. Every police officer in the current department would be guaranteed till their retirement to keep their job, or at least their salary. And what would happen then, by retirement and attrition, is that the current culture of policing would gradually disappear, while a new team would slowly take their place, driven by a separate agency's culture. Call it, for example, a Department of Public Safety that could begin operating with a few core functions, such as managing dispatching and other responses to 911 or 999 calls, or it could be producing crime analysis to support proactive policing of the most dangerous and high harm offenders. The key point is that the new agency would offer a different system of recruiting, paying, training, disciplining and retaining its officers under the leadership of a different kind of public safety professional, perhaps someone with a background in both policing and public health or mental health, the latter issue comprising a large portion of fatal police encounters with citizens. One suggestion of the abolished policing scholars, for example, is to redirect police funding to more and better mental health services. But since governments have spent the last half-century disavowing responsibility for community management of the mentally ill, it may be easier to change the policing responses to mental illness than to develop a new mental health institution. That is what this proposal could do and more. The crucial idea here is to build a new culture of problem solving rather than a culture of law enforcement. A culture of peacekeeping rather than a culture of dominance. If by 2030, a Minneapolis Department of Public Safety can do most of the work currently done by the Minneapolis Police, it could do so with a very strong moral imperative for policing by consent. That does not mean that they would ask criminals for permission to arrest them. What it does mean is that everything the public safety officers do would be based on a smartphone video of their actions being seen around the world, at least in theory. Policing by consent of the viewers of such videos would be the key test. Do most viewers of these videos in Minneapolis or elsewhere approve of what the public safety officers did? Such a change could also free policing from the tyranny of peer culture, the demand of American police and their dispatchers to resolve incidents quickly, even if that requires treating citizens abruptly or threatening the use of force. Drop the knife now. No time to argue. Just drop that knife. The Supreme Court says they can do that. If you don't drop the knife, you can be shot. But the Camden police have shown another way to do that, with a policy that you don't shoot. You create a cordon, you follow somebody for 8 minutes, and then you taser them without injury. There's a video of what happened in 2015 that fits those facts that you can watch on YouTube from the Camden Police Department. This kind of policing is part of the core principle of procedural justice training, which the abolished policing scholars have scorned as worthless. Most recently in a British newspaper, a leading British paper this week. Their criticism may be accurate against procedural justice if taking time to provide such response is not supported by all police systems and culture. They also need freedom for dispatchers or peers pressing officers to act too quickly. All these issues and more have been addressed by Professor David Klinger in the Annals volume on reducing fatal policing, writing with the authority of a former SWAT team officer in the LAPD. The crucial transition that he suggests and others would envision is from a value system supporting police rights to practice law enforcement to the exclusion of other values, to a value system that values the Hippocratic Oath. This oath, to first do no harm, may never have actually been stated by Hippocrates, the famous physician of Greece in the 4th century BC. But the bust of Hippocrates in my study, I think you can see him over there, reminds me of the heroic leadership of Police Chief J. Scott Thompson, formerly chief of both Camden City and Camden County in New Jersey. The essence of that philosophy is that in policing as in medicine, the first duty is to inflict as little collateral damage as possible, to use the least possible amount of harm to stop or prevent other harm. Thompson's philosophy of policing overlaps heavily with policing by consent. But it was not by philosophy alone that the British policing model cultivated those values. Since 1856, a mere 27 years after modern English policing was founded at Scotland Yard, the government of England and Wales has appointed an inspector of constabulary. This position was founded with the power to do exactly what many police critics are proposing today, to defund the police. While the power to withhold roughly half of the police budget has rarely been used by Her Majesty's inspectors of constabulary, the threat of that sanction has ensured the attention of local police chiefs to site visits and document reviews by Her Majesty's Inspectorate for a century and a half. That provides a strong basis for an organizational culture upholding a rule of law. As I recommended to President Obama's task force on policing in 2015, every state in America could establish an inspector general of policing. That recommendation did not make it into the task force report, unlike some of my other proposals, but we don't have any state ever having created such a position. It is arguably a key element of any sustainable police reform in the United States. If the question is framed properly, then a statewide inspector general of local policing is a very good answer. The proper question would be, how can citizens be assured that every police agency in the state has adopted and complies with the best standards of practice for policing, including the Hippocratic commitment to minimal harm to citizens? If an inspector general decertified a local police department, in most cases, it could be replaced immediately by the state police or a larger county police force. That state takeover of an inadequate local police agency could lead to redemption by improvements or a new plan for policing a community, at least across the over 400 local police departments of very small size across Minnesota. It is certainly a powerful tool for dealing with any rogue police culture in a police force of any size. But what about rogue cops? How can a state answer the question, the different question, of what can be done to reduce the hiring and retention of police officers who consistently abuse citizens and run very high risks of excessive force or criminal actions? Derek Chauvin had 18 complaints in 19 years of police service. Derek Chauvin had been involved in 3 shooting incidents and had shot somebody in the stomach. How does that fit into a statistical pattern of behavior in terms of the likely escalation of the damage done by persons of that profile? Using predictive policing on the police, a very new and high-tech answer to the question of preventing rogue cops could be created within a statewide inspector general's office. The program could be based on an algorithmic forecasting model for identifying, developing, or likely rogue cops based on thousands of police career patterns in a state or any place that has thousands of police officers over an extended period of time. Similarly, the same models could be used to predict who will make a good police officer even before they're hired, with better accuracy than the subjective judgments that are now widely used in what's called psychological assessment of officers. Had such a system been available to Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary in London for 2008, it might have identified the London constable who pushed down Ian Tomlinson during the G20 protests in 2009. That constable had like Derek Chauvin, an extensive record of losing his temper and disciplinary actions. Sadly, Mr. Tomlinson died, and the constable was later prosecuted. Prevention in London, as in the US, prevention would have been better, far better than prosecution. In summary, my proposal to my fellow American citizens is to ask the right questions, questions that are neither too broad nor too narrow. My proposal is to focus on legislative responses at the state level and to make that legislation feasible to be passed. Regardless of the merits of an end of policing strategy, for example, the realpolitik is that no state in America is likely to abolish the police. Even if it did, it would encounter such turmoil and crime and disorder that it would be quickly abandoned. That is the evidence for many police strikes over the past century, both in the US and the UK. As for my daughter's state governor, I commend him to examine the two key proposals I suggest. One is to use state legislation to dissolve broken police agencies and replace them with newer models. The other is to identify broken police agencies and rogue officers by the proactively deployed powers of a statewide Inspector General of Policing. I am sure that Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary would be happy to advise the state of Minnesota or any state in the US or abroad on how they have managed rogue police forces and rogue cops in England and Wales since 1856. I'm also sure that my Cambridge colleague, Dr. Jeffrey Barnes, a Pennsylvania native now working with New Scotland Yard and the developer of the Durham police algorithms for identifying high-risk offenders, I think Dr. Barnes would be happy to advise on how to use the same systems to predictively analyze the 9,667 Minnesota police officers working in over 400 police agencies in that state of 6 million people, or about one police force for every 15,000 people. I do not advise, however, that any state try to deal with the problem of too many police agencies. That battle is unwinnable. Our question should not just be what would work if it were possible. Our question must remain, what is possible to do? In a word, greater state powers to decertify police agencies and officers. That is our last best hope. That is my prayer for Minnesota. That is my prayer for the United States of America. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Larry, for this inspiring and interesting talk. This was truly fascinating and interesting. We got quite a number of questions in already, and there are more questions coming in. I hope I figured out the way to make the settings in such a way that everybody can effectively see the questions that have been asked. But I've put together some of the questions that were asked and will put them to you. One of them was by somebody called Richard. I don't know which Richard it is. And he commented saying, I'm struck by the parallels with the replacement of the Royal Ulster Constabulary by the Police Service of Northern Ireland. In this case, a deeply contested and in some quarters hated institution was replaced by an institution that seems to align with the moral and operational approaches that you suggest. And he's asking whether this experience provides a potentially suitable role model for the kind of reforms that you suggest for US policing agencies.
Well, I'd like to thank Richard for smacking me over the head with something I should have put in this talk. Because despite my mourning the loss of David Bailey, a great comparative policing scholar who served on the advisory board for building the Police Service of Northern Ireland to replace the Royal Ulster Constabulary, to build a democratically developed police force in the place of what is seen as a colonial police force then and still, I think. Yes, it's a wonderful model. it's perhaps not one that Americans would understand. And I have to confess to having had my head in America while I wrote this editorial, which will appear in the Cambridge Journal of Evidence-Based Policing within the month, and which I will be sending to the governor of Minnesota. But I do think that from the standpoint of understanding the challenge and the idea of a gradual transition, there is much to be learned in the case of the PSNI. And thank you for reminding us of that, Richard.
Larry, there were some questions about the broader context of policing in the United States. And I just wanted to combine two questions that I believe, touch on different levels, but they are related. Julian Constable asked, how would you respond to the assertion that attempts to improve police conduct at either the individual or the occupational level ultimately depend for their success on the wider context in which policing takes place? So is it possible to do police reforms without thinking about changing the wider context? And Peter Fahy was asking a related question, but at a more specific level, asking, is there any evidence that police departments that have higher levels of Black representation in their ranks have higher levels of confidence in their minority communities and less disproportionately use police powers?
Well, let me take Sir Peter Fahy's question first. Many of you know that Sir Peter was a long-term and widely admired Chief Constable of the Greater Manchester Police in England. And he has repeatedly lectured in our courses at Cambridge and is currently working on an international program to help homeless children in developing nations, which is quite a switch from being a Chief Constable in Britain. What Peter Fahy asks is one of the list of broader solutions beyond the Obama list, which I actually endorse, not as the answer to the question, but as a part of the standards you would want to see in a police force that would have an inspector general doing a routine inspection. But the question of minority hiring and having a police force that looks like the population it's policing, I think needs to be approached in a normative way. That is, you do it because it's the right thing to do. The instrumental idea that if you hire enough Black officers, the problem goes away, is actually riddled full of evidence falsifying the hypothesis. Freddie Gray was killed in Baltimore by officers who were predominantly Black, as I understand the story. In the New York City Police Department, Greg Ridgway's analysis shows that in discretionary incidents where some officers shoot and others don't, there's far greater use of weapons by Black officers against Black and white suspects. The fact that Minneapolis has a Black chief of police right now hasn't seemed to have prevented the kind of rogue cop problems with Derek Chauvin. There are many minority officers in Minneapolis. Tony Boza started hiring them substantial numbers along with women, again, because it was the right thing to do. But it wouldn't be on my list of the most urgent things to do to save lives and to reduce violence. But it does perhaps create a different context, and maybe not always in a good way, because lots of police shootings in Baltimore while I was living in Maryland, lots of police shootings of Black people by Black officers got a pass because of the race issues rather than the justice issues, rather than the rule of law. And I think that the only way we get out of racism is to take the rule of law seriously.
Thank you very much. I have to say that somebody commented in the question and answers saying that he or she, they can't see the questions and therefore also can't comment. Now, if that is in fact the case, I would really like to apologize to everybody, because in response to somebody raising the issue of whether the questions will be visible to everybody, I did try to change the settings in such a way that they should be visible to everybody. So if that hasn't happened, that is purely a result of my technical incompetence and not a result of my ill will. But talking about technologies and technological incompetence, I would like to raise the question that Holly Dempsey is asking. She's saying, it is no doubt important for police agencies to utilize cutting-edge technologies to effectively protect the public. However, some elements such as hotspot policing have been accused of increasing the likelihood of racial profiling by over-policing minority neighborhoods, and thus continuing to program police officers to view Black and Asian minority citizens as criminal and dangerous. How do these elements play into the creation of both rogue officers and rogue cultures?
It's a very good question to review, and I would suggest anybody who wants to pursue it that they could start with reading Malcolm Gladwell's latest book, which is called Talking to Strangers, in which he makes exactly the opposite argument. What he says is that as he reads the evidence, a lot of it done by people associated, produced by people associated with Cambridge, as well as George Mason, the work of David Weisberg, Anthony Braga at Northeastern, and others. Gladwell's read on the evidence is that hotspots policing saves Black lives. It reduces homicide where homicide is most likely to occur. And it surgically focuses police actions that are appropriate in those particular micro-ecologies and nowhere else. And his critique is that the idea of stop and search, extra intrusiveness, extra harm, was generalized from hotspots where they were absolutely necessary because people were carrying guns and knives all the time. All over the state of North Carolina, all over the places where there had not been murders or even serious injuries in many years. And his argument is really about the failure to do a focused targeting based on evidence and to reserve for that very peak of the mountain where the highest harm is located, the intrusive and potentially dangerous strategies that should be largely banned in other places. And if I could wave a magic wand, I would ban stop and searches, unless there's specific intelligence that somebody's carrying a weapon or has just stolen something. I would ban them anywhere that wasn't identified by rigorous data analysis as being a high probability location for serious violence.
Thank you. I think I would like to find the time for two more questions. The first one was asked by several people, a few people I saw in the list. One of them was Miriam Shovel. And the question really is about your idea to replace police departments with a new structure of police departments. She asks, well, how could you safeguard the replacement police departments, which you suggest from degrading into exactly the same problematic situation of the current departments? In other words, isn't there the risk that the culture that you have been criticizing would just be transported into the new generation of police departments?
Well, I didn't want to get too specific, and I didn't want to turn off a lot of police officers who would be hearing my talk. But in the 2002 publication, I said two things that answer that question. One is that nobody would have a contract for more than 3 years. And the other is they would be paid twice as much.
Okay.
So you give them the incentive, but they have to perform. And if their performance is slipping, then they can get a year's notice and get another job.
There were two questions, but one there was another question asked by several people, including Nicola Patfield, our colleague over at the law faculty, which is simply about this enormous number of police forces in the United States. And she asked the simple question, why do you think it's not possible to reduce the number of policing agencies?
The fundamental rule of politics is once an institution has acquired power, it does not want to give it up. And with these 18,000 police departments, we have 18,000 political cultures, political communities struggling for control of those departments and all of the benefits that come from having that control, both legal and corrupt. But certainly the desire for somebody who is on a city council to have a police force that they can supervise is substantial until, as is occasionally reported, it gets to be too hot to handle, at which point they will dissolve a police force, as Antioch, Ohio did a few years ago. A college town where there was a lot of pushback on the policing being too aggressive. So the city council just said, we don't want a police force anymore, we'll take the state police. And it's only in those rare circumstances where the kind of community that you have is above, shall we say, the rather meager rewards of local political influence. Most places in the United States are by definition rural. There's nobody around for a long way. And if you're going to have police who can come quickly, you need them to be local. They don't like state police patrolling all over Idaho to rely on to come to their village or their community. So there's lots of other issues besides just power and control. But we don't have any examples of any state in the US succeeding in consolidations outside of an urban area, with some exceptions of sheriffs, county level sheriffs taking over local villages. That would be the most common pattern. We're not going to get away from 18,000 anytime soon. I was tempted to recommend it in 2015 to the Obama panel, but the feedback was not good from even people who were persuaded it would make a difference, but it's just not feasible.
Okay.